Everyone froze when a granddaughter came to her grandfather's grave and noticed a hole right on it. She had no idea what was hidden inside, but what she discovered later shocked the entire family. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends, and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The sky above the small town was pale and colorless, a soft veil of gray clouds stretching as far as the eye could see. Aaliyah pressed her coat tighter around her shoulders as the bus pulled away behind her, leaving her standing on the cracked pavement with a suitcase in one hand and a small bouquet of lilies in the other. She had not been here in years, not since she left for the city to chase an education and the promise of something larger than the boundaries of her childhood. Yet now, at 20, she had come back, and not for celebration. Her grandfather was gone. The funeral had passed days ago, filled with condolences and family chatter, but the grief still lingered like damp air that never lifted. For Aaliyah, it was not just the loss of a grandfather, it was the loss of the man who had been her compass, the voice that had guided her when the rest of the world seemed uncertain. The streets were quiet as she walked toward the outskirts of town. She remembered them vividly, even though everything seemed smaller now, shrunk in the shadow of memory. The houses leaned into one another as if whispering old secrets, their chipped paint and sagging porches still holding the marks of years gone by. The bakery on the corner still smelled faintly of bread, though its windows were fogged and the sign hung lower than she remembered. Children no longer played in the yards. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog. The place had not changed much, but Aaliyah had, and that contrast weighed on her chest with every step. Her grandfather's house had been sold off quickly after the funeral. The relatives, many of whom she barely knew, had already begun circling the property like hawks at a carcass, discussing inheritances and shares even as the soil on the grave was still fresh. She couldn't bear to stay in the house where their voices echoed through the rooms he had once filled with laughter. Instead, she had booked a cheap room near the bus stop and made her way on foot to the cemetery, the bouquet trembling in her hands, not from the cold, but from the weight of memory. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, iron bars blackened by rust, creaking softly when she pushed them open. She stepped inside and was immediately met by the familiar quiet, the kind of silence that was not empty, but dense, filled with the presence of the past. Headstones rose around her in rows, some polished and well-kept, others leaning and cracked, their names fading with time. The air smelled of damp soil and wilted flowers. Somewhere in the distance a crow called, and its cry echoed, unsettling in the stillness. Aaliyah followed the narrow gravel path that wound between the graves. Each step crunched beneath her shoes, a rhythmic sound that grew louder in her ears the closer she came to his resting place. Her grandfather had been buried near the edge of the cemetery, beneath a tall oak tree whose branches stretched like protective arms over the graves beneath it. She remembered sitting under that tree as a child, listening to him tell stories, tales of his youth, his mistakes, his victories, and the lessons he wanted her to carry. He had been stern but gentle, a man whose presence demanded respect, but also offered comfort. When she reached his grave, her breath caught in her throat. The headstone was simple, his name carved in neat letters, and the soil was still dark and freshly turned. She knelt slowly, her knees pressing into the damp earth, and laid the bouquet across the mound. For a long while, she simply stared, unable to speak, her thoughts a whirlwind of regret and longing. She wished she had come home more often, wished she had listened longer when he spoke. wished she had not taken for granted that he would always be there. The silence pressed in on her and tears blurred her vision. She raised her hand to wipe her eyes, and that was when she noticed it. Beside the grave, just to the right of the headstone, the earth was uneven. At first it seemed nothing more than a patch of ground disturbed by careless feet, but as she leaned closer, the difference was unmistakable. The soil had been dug recently and then refilled. The texture was looser, the color slightly different from the rest. It looked hurried, almost sloppy, as though someone had worked under cover of darkness and left in haste. A chill ran through her spine. The rational part of her tried to explain it away. Perhaps the groundskeepers had adjusted something. Perhaps it was part of settling the earth after the burial. But deep within she felt unease stirring. She pressed her hand into the dirt, feeling how soft it was compared to the packed mound above the coffin. Something was wrong. She stood and looked around. The cemetery was empty. No workers, no visitors, just her and the whisper of wind in the trees. The oak branches swayed, and for a fleeting moment she imagined her grandfather's voice in the rustling leaves, as if urging her to pay attention, to not dismiss what her eyes were telling her. Aaliyah straightened and forced herself to step back. The bouquet looked almost out of place now, lying gently on the mound while this disturbed patch of earth screamed for attention. She bit her lip and tried to calm the racing of her heart. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe grief was twisting her perception. She had always been told that mourning made people imagine things, that sorrow filled the mind with shadows. But this didn't feel like imagination. It felt real. She lingered longer than she intended, staring at the ground until the sun dipped lower and the air grew colder. At last, she turned and walked back along the gravel path, her footsteps quick, her thoughts even quicker. Each step away from the grave only strengthened the unease gnawing inside her. She told herself she would return tomorrow. She needed to know if it would look the same in the morning, if the marks would still be there, or if time would erase them. That night in her room, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound of cars in the distance muffled by the thin walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the uneven soil, dark and fresh, as if it were calling to her. She remembered her grandfather's words, the ones he had spoken the summer before she left for school. "Never ignore what feels wrong," he had said, sitting with her beneath the oak tree. "Truth hides in the cracks most people don't notice. If you see something, if you feel it in your bones, you must follow it, no matter how small it seems." She had brushed off the advice then, too young to understand. Now, lying awake, those words pounded in her head. By morning, she could no longer deny it. Something was wrong at the grave, and she was the only one who seemed to have noticed. When the sun rose and the town stirred awake, Aaliyah dressed quickly and slipped out, heading once more toward the cemetery. Her heart pounded with every step, not from exertion but from anticipation, as though she already knew what she would find. The bouquet she had laid the day before was still fresh in her mind, and so too was the patch of disturbed earth that had refused to let her rest. She told herself that if it looked different today, if the ground was smoother, perhaps she could convince herself it had been nothing. But if it was the same, or worse, then she would have no choice but to confront whatever truth was hidden there. The cemetery gates loomed ahead once more, and as she pushed them open, their iron hinges groaned like a warning. She walked the path she now knew by heart, past headstones and flowers, past names of people whose lives had ended long before hers began. The oak tree swayed in the distance, marking the place where her grandfather slept, or was supposed to sleep. And as she approached, her breath quickened, her palms slick with sweat despite the chill in the morning air. She didn't know yet what she would find. But she knew one thing for certain. Her return to this town was not just about grief. It was the beginning of something else, something far more unsettling than she could have imagined. She reached the grave and her eyes fell instantly on the soil. The bouquet lay where she had left it, petals damp with dew. But the patch of ground beside the grave was worse than before. The earth was unsettled, the marks deeper, fresher, as if someone had been there again since she last stood watch. Her heart lurched. It was no mistake. Someone was tampering with her grandfather's grave. And in that moment, Aaliyah knew she would not be able to turn away. The air around the grave was heavy, colder than the rest of the cemetery, as though the oak tree itself leaned in with its massive branches to witness what Aaliyah was about to do. She stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the disturbed patch of soil, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. The bouquet of lilies she had placed the day before seemed fragile now, almost out of place, as if mocking the secrecy hidden in the ground beneath. She forced herself to take a deep breath, but the rhythm of her heart refused to slow, beating harder each second. Her mind tried to push her toward a simple explanation. Perhaps the gravediggers had returned to adjust something. Perhaps the rain had shifted the soil. Perhaps her tired eyes exaggerated what she saw. Yet every time she looked closer, all those excuses crumbled. The earth wasn't simply uneven. It was freshly disturbed. Someone had been here again since yesterday. She crouched down and touched the dirt with trembling fingers. It gave way too easily, softer than the surrounding ground, confirming what her eyes already knew. Aaliyah stood, wiping the soil from her hands against her coat, and turned her gaze around the cemetery. It was early enough that no one else was present, only a pair of crows circling lazily above and the long shadows cast by the gravestones. Still, she felt as if unseen eyes were watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck bristled, and she pressed her arms tighter around her body. She had grown up with stories of spirits and warnings whispered by older relatives, but what unsettled her now wasn't the thought of ghosts, it was the thought of the living. Whoever was disturbing the grave might still be nearby. She forced her feet to move, retracing the edges of the plot, scanning the ground for signs. It was then that she noticed them. Faint impressions in the soft soil leading away from the grave. They were not crisp enough to reveal much detail, but the shapes were there, a series of footprints pressed into the damp earth. They didn't belong to the heavy boots of a groundskeeper. These prints were narrower, lighter, as though someone careful had made them, yet still they betrayed a hurried pace. Aaliyah's pulse quickened. She followed the impressions, her shoes crunching softly on gravel as she tried to step where the stranger had stepped. The prints wound between gravestones, moving towards the far side of the cemetery where the grounds ended and a cluster of half-forgotten structures stood. The buildings were old, neglected remnants of another time when caretakers had lived on site. She remembered them vaguely from childhood visits. A tool shed, a workshop, and the long-abandoned house of the former watchman. As she drew nearer, the prints seemed to merge with the path of dead leaves and twigs, harder to distinguish now, but she could sense their direction as if something pulled her forward. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of damp wood. Aaliyah stopped at the edge of the path and looked at the small row of dilapidated structures. Most of the windows were boarded, and the roofs sagged under years of neglect. She had been told to stay away from them when she was little, but children had dared one another to peek through cracks in the walls, swearing they saw shadows move inside. Now, in the light of day, the buildings looked less like places of ghost stories and more like places that might conceal secrets of flesh and bone. Her eyes lingered on one in particular, the shed tucked furthest into the trees. Its frame leaned sideways, one door hanging loose while the other appeared strangely intact, as though someone had tended it while the rest decayed. A chill rippled through her as she realized this was where the footprints seemed to lead. She hesitated, the rational voice in her mind urging her to turn back, to tell someone, to involve the police or at least another family member. But another, stronger voice pushed forward, the memory of her grandfather's words, urging her never to ignore what felt wrong. Aaliyah swallowed hard and stepped toward the shed. The closer she came, the more she noticed details she couldn't ignore. The door's hinges were oiled. It didn't creak like the others. The weeds around the threshold were pressed down, trampled recently. On the ground, a thin layer of dirt carried faint lines where something heavy had been dragged. She crouched and traced one with her finger, feeling the groove. Her stomach twisted at the thought of what might have been hauled through that doorway. She stood quickly, brushing her hands against her coat, and her eyes darted around, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But the cemetery remained still, silent except for the caw of a distant bird. She drew a shaky breath and placed her hand on the door. To her surprise, it opened easily, as though waiting for her. The smell of stale air and dust rushed out, carrying with it a hint of something damp and metallic. Inside, shadows clung to the corners. A shaft of daylight slipped through a crack in the roof, illuminating the dust swirling in the air. The shed was cluttered with the remnants of tools, rusted shovels, broken rakes, the skeleton of a wheelbarrow, but her eyes were drawn not to these relics, but to the center of the floor. There, half hidden beneath a warped wooden table, was a square of wood that didn't match the rest. Its edges were too neat, its surface cleaner than the surrounding boards. Aaliyah stepped closer, her breath catching as she crouched to look. It was a hatch, concealed poorly, almost daring discovery. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge, and felt the cool metal of a latch. The air around her seemed to tighten, as though the cemetery itself held its breath. For a moment, she froze, listening to the hammering of her heart. What would she find if she opened it? What could possibly lie beneath the shed, beneath the ground that should hold only roots and bones? Her hand trembled as she let go, pulling back before the weight of her fear overwhelmed her. She stumbled to her feet and backed away from the hatch, her eyes scanning the dim corners of the shed as if expecting something to move. Nothing did. Only silence pressed in, heavier than before. She turned and fled outside, gulping the cold air as though surfacing from deep water. She stood in the clearing, her chest rising and falling rapidly, and tried to collect her thoughts. The grave disturbed. Footprints leading here. A concealed hatch inside a shed long abandoned. None of it was coincidence. Something deliberate was happening, something tied to her grandfather's grave, and for reasons she could not yet understand, it seemed meant for her to discover. Aaliyah's hands curled into fists. She could not tell her family, not yet. They had already shown more interest in dividing possessions than in mourning the man who raised her. They would dismiss her suspicions or twist them to their own ends. No, this was her burden, her secret to unravel. For the first time since she stepped off the bus, she felt a strange clarity settle over her. She would come back. She would open the hatch. She would find out what truth waited in the shadows of the earth. The sun was already sliding westward, its rays streaking orange through the trees, when Aaliyah began the walk back through the cemetery. She did not look again at the disturbed soil beside her grandfather's grave. She did not need to. The image was burned into her mind, a brand she could not erase. Each step she took away from the oak felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself sought to hold her back, to keep her near the secrets it guarded. But she pressed on, her jaw set, her eyes forward. That night, in the thin-walled room she rented, Aaliyah once again found no sleep. Every sound seemed magnified, the ticking of the old clock on the dresser, the muffled voices from the street below, the creak of the building settling in the wind. She tossed and turned, her mind consumed by what she had seen, by what she had nearly uncovered. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the hatch beneath the table, its dark edges calling to her. Each time she tried to silence her thoughts, she heard her grandfather's voice, calm and steady, urging her to be brave. By the time dawn arrived, spilling pale light across the floorboards, Aaliyah had made her decision. The fear was still there, heavy in her chest, but stronger than fear was resolve. She would return to the shed. She would lift the hatch. She would learn why her grandfather's grave had been disturbed, and what secrets had been hidden beneath the soil of the cemetery. For the first time since his passing, she felt not just grief, but a strange, driving purpose. Her grandfather had left her something, though she didn't yet know what, and she was determined to find it, even if it meant descending into darkness. Morning light broke across the town in muted shades of gold, but to Aaliyah it felt like another heavy veil pressing against her chest. The decision she had made during the sleepless hours of the night clung to her like an oath. She could not ignore what she had seen. The disturbed soil by the grave, the trail of footprints, and the hatch hidden in the shed, they were no accidents. They were part of something her instincts told her had been waiting for her to discover. She left her small rented room before most of the town was awake, carrying only a flashlight she had purchased from a hardware store on her way back the evening before. The sun had risen, but she knew the shed would be dark, its insides swallowed in shadow. Her heart was steady, but not calm. Fear moved through her blood like a second pulse, but beneath it was a stronger current. Resolve. Whatever secrets lay beneath that hatch, she would no longer turn away from them. The walk to the cemetery felt different that morning. The streets she had once found nostalgic now seemed like a silent audience to her growing unease. Each cracked sidewalk and peeling house front looked almost watchful, as though the entire town knew she was about to unearth something best left buried. When the iron gates of the cemetery appeared in the distance, she felt her stomach twist, but her steps did not falter. She entered quickly, the gate's hinges groaning in protest, the sound echoing behind her like a warning she refused to heed. The oak tree loomed ahead, its branches stretching across the graves like skeletal fingers. She did not linger this time at her grandfather's tombstone. She could not bear to kneel before it while questions thundered in her mind. Instead, she cast only a brief glance at the disturbed patch of earth beside it, confirming what she already knew. The soil looked worse than the day before, pressed and stirred as though the unseen visitor had returned yet again. Aaliyah clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around the flashlight. There was no more room for hesitation. The trail of footprints, faint and nearly erased by the elements, led her once again toward the forgotten cluster of structures. The morning air was cool, carrying with it the smell of damp leaves and rust. As she approached, the shapes of the old buildings sharpened into view. Their decay seemed almost theatrical, as though they had been abandoned centuries ago, but the shed at the end of the row betrayed a different story. Its door still sat neatly in place, its hinges oiled, its weeds trampled underfoot. Someone cared for this building in secret. Someone used it. Aaliyah paused at the threshold, her breath shallow. A memory surfaced. She was 8 years old, clutching her grandfather's hand as they passed the cemetery on the way home from the market. She had asked about the sheds then, frightened by their broken windows and leaning frames. He had looked at them with an unreadable expression and told her to stay away. "Some doors," he had said softly, "lead to places you may not want to go." The weight of his words now pressed against her chest with an intensity that almost broke her resolve. But she shook her head, reminding herself that he had trusted her with courage, and courage was what she needed now. She reached for the door and pulled. The wood shifted without resistance, opening into the gloom. Dust rose to greet her, swirling in the beam of sunlight that pierced through a crack in the roof. The air smelled of earth, wood, and something faintly metallic, a tang that reminded her of old coins or rusting iron. Her footsteps were soft as she entered, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The room was exactly as she remembered. Tools long abandoned, their metal edges dulled with rust, broken planks leaning in the corners, a wheelbarrow with one missing wheel collapsed on its side. But she was not here for these relics. She was here for the hatch. The table loomed in the center, warped and crooked, its legs barely supporting its weight. She stepped closer and crouched, her flashlight beam sweeping across the floor. There it was, the square piece of wood that did not match the rest, its edges neat, its latch faintly glinting in the light. She swallowed hard, every nerve in her body screaming at her to turn back, yet her hand reached forward all the same. The metal of the latch was cold against her fingertips. For a moment, she hesitated, her grandfather's warning echoing again in her memory. But then, she pulled, and the hatch lifted with surprising ease. The stale breath of the earth rushed up to meet her, a heavy draft of damp soil and mildew that made her cough. The darkness beneath yawned wide, deeper than she expected, and she realized a ladder was fixed to the side, descending into a tunnel below. Her legs trembled as she steadied herself, shining her flashlight down the opening. Wooden beams framed the shaft, and the ladder's rungs, though old, looked sturdy enough to hold her weight. She felt the press of silence all around her, so thick it almost had texture. With one last deep breath, she gripped the sides of the hatch, set her foot on the first rung, and began to climb down. The air grew cooler as she descended, each step creaking softly beneath her weight. Shadows closed in, and the beam of her flashlight carved only a narrow path through the dark. She tried not to think of the ground above her, closing away the world of light, or the weight of the earth pressing down from all sides. She focused only on moving downward, one rung at a time, until her feet touched solid ground. The tunnel stretched before her, low and narrow, its walls reinforced by rotting wooden beams. The floor was uneven, a mix of dirt and stone, and her flashlight revealed cobwebs glistening like silver threads. She moved cautiously, her breath loud in the stillness. It was not as abandoned as it first appeared. There were signs of use. A lantern sat on a wooden shelf jutting from the wall, its glass recently cleaned. Footprints marked the dirt, faint but fresh. Someone had been here, perhaps even in the past day. She pressed on, her steps echoing faintly, until the tunnel widened into a chamber. Her heart leapt as her flashlight revealed what lay inside. A small room, carved roughly into the earth, its walls lined with old crates and shelves. Papers lay stacked on a table, heavy with dust, though some piles looked disturbed as though touched not long ago. Against one wall stood a chest, its iron fittings tarnished but intact, and on the central table, illuminated by her trembling light, sat a sealed envelope. Her name was written on it in her grandfather's handwriting. Aaliyah froze, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. She stepped forward slowly, her hand reaching out, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. Her name, written in the familiar, deliberate strokes, made her throat tighten. He had known she would come. He had left this for her. The shed above her head creaked faintly, a groan of wood shifting under unseen weight. Aaliyah jerked her head up, the flashlight beam scattering across the ceiling. For a long moment, she held her breath, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. Only silence pressed in again, thick and unyielding. She turned her gaze back to the table, to the envelope that seemed to glow in the pale light. Her grandfather's secret was here, waiting for her, and she knew with absolute certainty that opening it would change everything she thought she knew about his death, and about her family. She slipped the envelope into her coat pocket, her hands trembling, and looked around the chamber one last time. The crates, the chest, the papers, they all begged for her attention, but she knew she could not linger, not yet. She had seen enough to know the truth was here, hidden in the earth, and that she was its chosen witness. Climbing back up the ladder, she felt each rung press against her hands, each step heavier than the last. When she emerged into the shed again, the daylight seemed brighter, almost blinding. She closed the hatch carefully, sliding the table back into place, and stood in the silence of the abandoned building, her pulse still racing. She knew she would return. She had to. But for now, she had taken the first piece of the puzzle. As she stepped outside, the cemetery seemed to hold its breath again, as though it knew she carried a secret not meant for the others. She walked quickly, her hand pressed to the envelope in her pocket, her eyes scanning the gravestones as if expecting one of them to rise and question her. The oak tree loomed in the distance, and she could not resist one last glance at her grandfather's grave. The soil remained disturbed, the mark of something unresolved, something waiting. Aaliyah turned away and left the cemetery, her steps quick, her mind racing with questions she could no longer ignore. She had opened the door her grandfather had warned her about. Now she had to face whatever truth lay beyond it. The streets of the town seemed strangely distant as Aaliyah walked back to her rented room, the sealed envelope pressing against her chest through the fabric of her coat. Her mind was racing faster than her steps, filled with the image of that dimly lit underground chamber, the crates, the chest, the table, and the envelope with her name written in her grandfather's hand. She could hardly breathe from the weight of it. Every nerve in her body was alive with both dread and expectation, as though she had unearthed a part of the world she was never meant to see. Back in the small room with its thin curtains and worn carpet, she sat on the bed, her hands trembling as she took the envelope out. The handwriting was unmistakable. Each letter was drawn with the same deliberate care she remembered from the notes he used to leave her as a child, small reminders folded into her lunchbox or tucked into the corners of her school books. Seeing her name written again in his hand made her eyes sting, and for a long time she simply stared at it, her thumb brushing across the familiar curves of the ink. At last, with a breath that felt as heavy as stone, she tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter several pages long, the paper slightly yellowed but still firm, as though it had been preserved with intention. She unfolded it slowly, her heart pounding, and began to read. "My dear Aaliyah," it began, and already her throat tightened at the sight of the words. "If you are reading this, it means you did not look away. It means you noticed what others ignored, and you followed the path I left for you. I knew you would. You always had the eyes to see truth where others refused." The letter continued, her grandfather's voice unfurling in her mind with each line. He wrote of his doubts, how for many years he had watched his children, her uncles and aunts, with growing unease. He had built his tavern, his land, and his modest fortune through decades of hard work, and yet he feared they saw only his possessions and not his heart. He had tried to test their love in life through small sacrifices, but he had seen how quickly they quarreled, how they whispered behind his back about inheritance. He feared that when he died there would be no mourning, only division. "I could not leave this world uncertain," he wrote, "so I made a plan. I wanted to see how they would behave when they believed I was gone. I wanted to know who would remember me as a man, not as a key to wealth. And I wanted you, my dearest granddaughter, to be the one to uncover the truth." Aaliyah's eyes blurred as she read further. He explained that the coffin they buried had never held his body. It was empty, lowered into the earth only for show. He had constructed the tunnel decades earlier, originally as a place to store valuables when he feared the bank could not be trusted. Over the years, it had become something more, a refuge, a place where he could retreat, and later the stage for his final act. He had hidden himself there after the funeral, slipping through the passage, and had been watching, waiting. Her hand shook as she lowered the page for a moment, her breath shallow. The thought of him alive, hiding only a short distance away while the family gathered in grief, was almost unbearable. Yet it was not just grief she remembered from that day. It was the way her relatives had spoken in sharp, clipped tones, already arguing about the tavern and the land. She had tried to shut out their voices, but now, reading his words, she realized he had heard them too, and his heart had been broken by what he saw. She returned to the letter. "I knew I could not trust them with what I had built. But you, Aaliyah, you have always looked at me with eyes unclouded by greed. You came to me not for what I owned, but for who I was. You listened when others ignored. That is why I chose you. I left the letter for you because I knew you would come back to me, even after the others forgot." Tears spilled down her cheeks. The letter went on to describe what he had left behind. Documents were stored in the crates and chest, records of his will, evidence of his decision to donate everything he owned to those in need. The tavern, the land, the savings, none of it would go to the family. It would all be passed on to charities, orphanages, shelters for the homeless. He had arranged it carefully with a lawyer who shared his secrecy. "They will rage," he wrote. "They will curse my name. But they will know the truth, that love cannot be bought, and that greed reaps nothing in the end." The final page bore words that cut through her like fire. "But know this, child, though I could not leave them my wealth, I leave you something greater. I leave you my trust. Protect these documents. Protect the truth of what I have done. You are the only one who can carry it." Her hand slipped as she set the letter down, her tears staining the page. She pressed her palms to her face, her body shaken with sobs that tore through the silence of the room. It was not just grief that overwhelmed her, but the crushing weight of responsibility. He had chosen her. He had placed in her hands the truth that would shatter her family. Hours passed before she rose again, folding the letter carefully back into the envelope and tucking it deep into her bag. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her resolve had grown. She could not ignore this. She would have to return to the chamber to examine the documents and gather everything her grandfather had left behind. The thought terrified her of what more she might find, of who else might already know of the tunnel, but she had no choice. By the time the sun dipped low again, she was back at the cemetery. The shadows stretched long between the graves, and the oak tree rustled in the evening breeze as though whispering her name. She walked swiftly, not allowing herself to hesitate, and reached the shed. Inside, the air was just as thick, the silence just as heavy, but now she knew what lay beneath. She pushed aside the table, opened the hatch, and descended once more into the dark. The beam of her flashlight swept over the tunnel, and this time she walked with more certainty. When she reached the chamber, she laid the letter on the table and turned her attention to the chest. Its iron fittings resisted at first, but with effort she pried it open. Inside were stacks of papers, folders carefully tied with string, and leather-bound ledgers filled with names and numbers. She leafed through them, recognizing deeds to property, receipts, even a copy of his revised will. It was all real. He had not only written of it, he had done it. Her hands trembled as she stacked the documents neatly, her eyes scanning every page. She felt as though she were touching not just paper, but the heartbeat of her grandfather's final years, every choice he had made culminating in this hidden archive. On the shelves nearby she found journals, his handwriting filling page after page with reflections on life, notes of disappointment, flashes of pride, and letters to people he never sent. She read fragments aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber as if speaking them might keep him alive. Yet the air was growing colder and the silence around her heavier. She realized she could not stay too long. Someone had been here before her. Someone had tended the hinges. Someone had made those footprints. She could not know whether they had discovered what her grandfather had left, or if they would return. Fear gnawed at her, but she pushed it down, gathering a few key documents and the journals she could carry. She would return for the rest when she could. Climbing back up the ladder, she felt again the press of the earth, the crushing weight of secrets that were never meant to come to light. When she emerged into the shed and slid the table back over the hatch, she paused, listening. The night was alive with crickets now, the air sharper with the scent of dew. She slipped out into the open, the documents pressed to her chest, and began the long walk back to town. Her grandfather's voice seemed to walk with her, steady and clear in her mind. Truth hides in the cracks, he had told her once. She understood now. The cracks were wide open, and she had stepped through them into a world of secrets that could not be undone. Aaliyah knew that everything would change. Her family, her place in their world, even her understanding of the man she had loved so deeply. She carried not just his words, but his legacy. And it was only the beginning. The walk back from the cemetery felt longer that night than it ever had before. Aaliyah carried the bundle of journals and documents close against her chest, as if the papers themselves might try to slip away if she loosened her grip even slightly. Every sound in the dark seemed louder. Every rustle of leaves or crack of twigs along the roadside made her heart pound faster, and she found herself glancing back more often than she cared to admit. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of earth cooling under the weight of night, and with every step she felt the gravity of what she now bore. It was more than just paper. It was her grandfather's voice, his vision, his final judgment of the people he had once called family. Back in her rented room, she locked the door and set the bundle carefully on the bed, her hands trembling as though she had been carrying fragile glass. She lit the small lamp on the desk, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows just enough to give her courage, and then she sat down and began to read. Page after page unfolded before her eyes, each line of her grandfather's handwriting a thread connecting her to him even beyond death. She read until her eyes burned, until her back ached, until the first pale light of dawn crept into the room. The journals began years before her birth, filled with stories of his struggles to establish his tavern, of long days laboring on the land, and of sacrifices he made to put food on the table and save a little for the future. As the years moved forward, the tone shifted. There were still moments of warmth and pride, reflections on Aaliyah's visits as a child, on the way her laughter filled the house, on the comfort he found in their walks beneath the oak tree. But more and more, disappointment seeped into his words. Notes about arguments with his children, about their impatience for him to retire, about whispered conversations he overheard that centered not on his well-being, but on the size of his accounts. Aaliyah's chest tightened as she read his doubts. He had loved them, of course, but he had not trusted them. He feared that once he was gone, their love would wither like a flower without sunlight, replaced by hunger for his possessions. And in those pages, he confessed that he could not rest without knowing the truth. That was when he began to plan the test that would define his final years. The documents that accompanied the journals painted the rest of the picture. Copies of deeds, bank statements, and most importantly, a revised will, signed and notarized, leaving the tavern, the land, and his savings not to his children, but to organizations that would use them for good. A children's shelter in the next city, a program to house veterans, a foundation that provided meals for the homeless. He had written in clear, unwavering terms. None of his direct heirs would receive anything. Instead, every last resource would go to those in need. Aaliyah pressed the will flat on the desk, her fingers trembling on the edges of the paper. It was undeniable proof. Her grandfather had seen everything clearly and had chosen his course with deliberate care. She could imagine the storm it would unleash when the rest of the family discovered it. They would rage, they would curse. They would accuse her of lies, of manipulation, perhaps even of forging the papers. But the evidence was here, undeniable and strong, and he had trusted her to be the one to carry it. For the first time, the full weight of that trust settled on her shoulders. She was not only his granddaughter now, she was his executor in spirit, the keeper of his truth. That realization brought a sob up from her chest, sharp and sudden. She buried her face in her hands and cried, the tears soaking through her fingers. She cried for the man she had loved and lost, for the family that had already begun to unravel, and for herself, caught in the middle of a legacy that would divide them forever. When her tears finally subsided, she lifted her head and looked again at the journals spread across the bed. There was a gentleness in some of his words that steadied her heart. In one passage he wrote of her directly, "Aaliyah does not yet understand how strong she is. One day she will. One day she will stand where others fall away, and she will hold fast." Reading those lines, she felt a strange warmth pierce through the grief, a reassurance that even though he was gone, he still believed in her. But belief was not enough. She would need strength, more strength than she had ever known, Already she could imagine the confrontation looming on the horizon. Her relatives would not simply accept this fate. They would fight it, tooth and nail, clinging to the inheritance they thought was theirs. They would turn on her, perhaps hate her for being the bearer of truth. And yet, she knew she had no choice. To betray his trust would be to betray everything he had stood for, every lesson he had given her. As evening fell once more, Aaliyah returned to the chamber beneath the shed, driven by the need to collect more of the documents and to see the place again, to reassure herself it had not been a dream. The air was still thick and cool underground, the silence oppressive, but now she walked with a steadier step. She gathered the remaining files, stacked them neatly, and carried them up one bundle at a time. By the time she locked the door of her room again, her arms ached from the weight, but her heart was firm. She had what she needed. The truth was hers to reveal. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the journals stacked beside her bed like silent companions. The memory of her relatives' faces at the funeral came unbidden. Smiles too quick to fade, voices too sharp when they thought no one was listening, eyes that never once lingered on the grave but darted toward one another with unspoken calculations. The contrast between their behavior and her own grief made her stomach twist. He had been right. He had seen them as they truly were. Aaliyah's thoughts drifted back to the oak tree at the cemetery, to the way its branches had seemed to whisper in the wind, to the way her grandfather's voice seemed to echo through its leaves. She had always felt safe there, as if the world could not touch her beneath its shade. Now, that tree was more than memory. It was a guardian over his secret, a witness to the test he had set in motion. She felt sure that when the time came to reveal what she had found, she would return to that tree, to the grave that did not hold his body, and speak the truth aloud. As the hours passed and the night deepened, a strange calm settled over her. She understood that the coming days would tear her family apart, but she also knew she could not shrink from it. Her grandfather had placed the truth in her hands, and she would not fail him. When the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, she rose and washed her face in the small sink, the cold water shocking her awake. She looked into the cracked mirror above it and saw her own reflection staring back. Tired, yes, but steadier than before. She no longer felt like a frightened girl stumbling into darkness. She felt like the woman her grandfather had believed she could become. Aaliyah turned from the mirror, gathered the papers into her bag, and sat on the bed, waiting for the inevitable. She knew her relatives would soon gather again at the tavern to discuss the division of what they thought was theirs. And when they did, she would be ready. She would carry the truth with her, and she would not be silent. The legacy was hers now, not of wealth, but of truth, of memory, and of unyielding trust. And she would honor it, no matter what it cost. The morning of the gathering came with a heavy stillness, the kind of air that carried more weight than sound. Aaliyah woke before dawn, the papers and journals still stacked neatly on the table beside her bed. She had spent much of the night sitting upright in the chair, staring at the handwriting that brought her grandfather's voice back to life, repeating his words silently until they burned into her memory. By the time the first pale light crept across the floorboards, she was no longer simply tired. She was braced, her resolve drawn tight like a string. She knew what awaited her when she stepped into the tavern later that day, the very tavern her grandfather had poured his life into. The others would already be circling, already calculating how much they could take, already sharpening their voices to cut each other apart. and she would walk into their storm carrying the truth they least wanted to hear. By mid-morning, the small town buzzed faintly with the gossip of neighbors who had not yet moved on from the funeral. Aaliyah could feel their eyes on her as she walked the street, her bag heavy at her side. It was not unusual. Everyone had known Arthur, the old tavern keeper, the man who had once been respected for his hard work and quiet dignity. But what none of them knew was that his story was not finished, and that the letter and documents she carried would rewrite everything. She quickened her pace, ignoring the whispers that trailed behind her until the familiar building came into view. The tavern stood at the heart of the town, a sturdy structure of wood and stone that had weathered decades of storms. Its windows reflected the weak light of day, and its sign, though faded, still swung gently in the breeze. Aaliyah paused at the door, pressing her palm flat against the grain of the wood. She remembered sitting inside as a little girl, her grandfather's hand warm on her shoulder as he told her to take pride in honest work, to never let greed turn her heart. Those memories were a shield now, and she leaned on them as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of old ale and dust, and the murmur of voices filled the room. Around the central table sat her uncles and aunts, their expressions drawn tight with suspicion and impatience. Papers were already spread across the table. Lists of assets, estimates of value, names of lawyers scribbled in hurried notes. They looked up when she entered, and a flicker of unease passed through the room. It was as though her presence reminded them that someone else had a claim to the story they were trying to write for themselves. Her Aunt Clara, the eldest of the siblings, spoke first, her tone clipped and cold. "You're late," she said, though Aaliyah knew the meeting had only just begun. Her Uncle Richard muttered something under his breath about the girl who barely lived here showing up to take what she didn't earn, and the others nodded, their agreement unspoken but clear in their eyes. Aaliyah did not answer immediately. She walked to the table, set her bag carefully on the chair beside her, and sat down with a calmness she did not truly feel. The voices resumed around her, rising and falling in sharp tones as they argued over who should claim the tavern, who deserved the land, who would handle the accounts. It was exactly as her grandfather had written, exactly as he had feared. They spoke as though he were not a man who had lived, but a vault that had been unlocked and left for them to plunder. She listened for a long while, her gaze steady, her heart beating harder with every selfish word. They did not notice her silence, too absorbed in their quarrels to see the storm building behind her calm eyes. But when Uncle Richard slammed his hand on the table and declared that the tavern should rightfully be his because he had worked there once in his youth, something inside her broke. She reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope, laying it on the table with deliberate care. The room fell silent, the voices cutting off as if sliced by a blade. "What's that?" Clara asked, suspicion darkening her face. Aaliyah looked at each of them in turn before speaking, her voice clear though her hands trembled beneath the table. "It's a letter from Grandfather, and documents, the truth about what he left behind." The silence stretched, thick and uneasy. No one moved as she opened the envelope and drew out the letter, unfolding the pages with the same reverence she had felt the night before. She began to read aloud, her voice steady, each word striking the air with weight. Her grandfather's words filled the tavern as though he were there himself, his disappointment, his sorrow, his decision to see who truly loved him and who only loved his possessions. Faces around the table paled. Clara shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed tight, while Richard's eyes narrowed in disbelief. Another aunt muttered that it had to be a trick, that Aaliyah was making it up, but her voice faltered as the clarity of the handwriting and the unmistakable truth of the message stared back at them. When Aaliyah reached the part where her grandfather declared that everything, every penny, every acre, every stone of the tavern would go to charity, the silence shattered. Shouts erupted, voices overlapping in fury and denial. Clara slammed her fist on the table, demanding to see the documents. Richard accused Aaliyah of forging the papers, his voice rising until it cracked. Another aunt began to weep, her tears not for the man they had lost, but for the money slipping through her fingers. Aaliyah stood her ground, her eyes blazing with a strength she had not known she possessed. She spread the deeds, the will, and the notarized statements across the table for them to see. Every seal, every signature, every line of ink was proof undeniable. "He made his choice," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the din. "This is what he wanted. Not one of you can change it." The arguments grew louder, but she no longer flinched at them. She saw them for what they were. People exposed, stripped of the pretense of mourning, revealed in their hunger. Her grandfather had been right all along. In that moment, she felt closer to him than ever, as though his hand rested on her shoulder once more, steadying her. The meeting ended not with agreement, but with collapse. The siblings stormed out one by one, their anger echoing in the hollow space of the tavern. Clara lingered the longest, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and something almost like shame, before she too left without another word. Aaliyah remained behind, gathering the papers slowly, her hands gentle as if she were handling a sacred trust. When the last footsteps faded, the tavern was silent again. She looked around at the wooden beams, the worn bar, the chairs that had held generations of townsfolk. For a moment, she imagined her grandfather standing behind the counter, polishing glasses with the same quiet pride he had always carried. She felt tears rise again, but this time they were not only of grief, they were of resolve. She stepped outside into the fading light, the cool air brushing against her face. The town was still, but she no longer cared about the whispers or the looks that might follow. She had faced her family, she had spoken the truth, and she had not faltered. Yet she knew this was not the end. Their anger would not vanish. They would return, perhaps with sharper claws, perhaps with schemes to twist the truth. But she would be ready. Her grandfather's legacy was not wealth, not buildings or land. It was truth, it was trust, and it was hers to defend, no matter how fierce the storm became. The tavern was still echoing with the memory of their anger long after they had gone. Aaliyah remained seated at the table, the papers spread before her like fragile artifacts of another world, her hands resting lightly on them as if to shield them from the storm that had just passed. The air still vibrated with her family's shouts, accusations, and threats. But now there was silence, deep and resonant, a silence that belonged to her alone. She sat in it for a long while, listening not to the fading footsteps that had stormed out, but to the quiet voice inside her, the one that carried her grandfather's steadiness. She realized she had not been broken by their fury. She had been made stronger by it. When she finally gathered the documents back into her bag, the weight of them no longer felt like a burden, but like an anchor. She stood slowly, her body weary yet upright, and turned one last time to look around the tavern. She could almost see her grandfather there, wiping down the counter, humming under his breath, nodding to her as if to say she had done well. The image steadied her heart, and she stepped out into the night, closing the heavy wooden door behind her. The streets were empty as she walked, her footsteps hollow against the cobblestones. The town that once seemed small and familiar now felt altered, its shadows longer, its silence fuller. Yet she no longer feared the whispers of neighbors or the resentment of her family. What they thought no longer had power over her. What mattered was what she carried in her bag and in her heart. Her grandfather's truth, his trust, his final choice. The days that followed were not easy. Her relatives did not simply fade into the background. They lingered, circling like vultures, still convinced there was something left to claim. They confronted her in hushed corners of the street, their words sharp, their eyes venomous. Some tried to plead, to convince her she had misunderstood, that perhaps the documents were a mistake. Others lashed out in anger, accusing her of deceit, of manipulation, of betrayal. But Alea met their eyes and held her ground. She knew the papers were real. She knew the words were true, and she knew that nothing they said could change what her grandfather had already decided. It was not only them she had to face. The lawyer, the charities, the officials who handled the transfer of property, all had questions, doubts, procedures that needed to be followed. Each meeting was a test of her resolve, but she carried her grandfather's journals and his letter as proof, his voice echoing in her memory whenever she faltered. Slowly, piece by piece, the work was done. The tavern was sold, the land distributed, the funds directed to the places he had chosen. She signed the documents with a hand that trembled at first, but steadied as the ink dried. She was carrying out his last will, and though the process was heavy, it was right. Her family's rage only grew as the reality became clear. Clara stopped speaking to her altogether, her silence colder than any words. Richard spat curses when they crossed paths in the street. Others muttered behind closed doors, their bitterness feeding on itself. Yet not one of them returned to the grave, not one laid flowers or bowed their head beneath the oak tree. They had lost their claim to wealth, and with it they seemed to lose any claim to memory. Alea alone returned. She went often, carrying fresh flowers in her hands, kneeling at the mound of earth where the headstone stood tall and simple. She would brush away the leaves, straighten the ground, and sit there for hours, speaking softly to the silence as if her grandfather could hear her. She told him of the meetings, of the anger, of the loneliness that sometimes pressed against her heart. She told him of her determination to see it through, to make sure his will was honored to the very last detail. And though no voice answered, she felt his presence in the whisper of the oak branches above, in the warmth of the sun when it broke through the clouds, in the stillness that wrapped around her when she closed her eyes. It was during one such visit that she brought the medallion he had left for her, a small piece of jewelry she had found tucked into one of the journals. It was old, simple, and worn smooth from years of being carried in his pocket. She held it in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the way it warmed against her skin. And then she placed it gently on the stone. "I'll carry you with me," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible. "Not this medal, but what you gave me, the strength, the truth." The medallion gleamed faintly in the light before she lifted it again and slipped it back into her pocket. It was not meant to stay there on the stone. It was meant to stay with her. A reminder of what she had been given and of the trust she had sworn to uphold. She rose slowly, brushed the dirt from her hands, and looked out across the cemetery. The graves stretched in neat rows, each one a story closed, but hers was still being written. She knew that. She felt it in every breath she took. By the time weeks had passed and the last of the property had been transferred, Aaliyah found herself standing at the edge of the town, a small suitcase by her side. She had no reason to stay. The tavern was no longer theirs, the house no longer in the family, and the relatives who once might have called her kin now looked at her with nothing but bitterness. But she did not feel cast out. She felt free. She had honored her grandfather's choice. She had carried out his will, and now she could step into her own life with the knowledge that she had been faithful to him until the very end. Still, before she left, she walked once more to the oak tree. The air was crisp, the branches swaying gently as though bidding her farewell. She knelt at the grave, her fingers tracing the carved letters of his name, and for a long while she stayed there in silence. When she finally stood, she felt no more fear, no more doubt, only peace. As she walked away, her steps lightened, her path stretching open before her like a road waiting to be traveled. She did not know where it would lead, but she knew who she was now. She was not the girl who had arrived trembling at a disturbed patch of soil. She was the woman her grandfather had believed in, the one who had chosen love over greed, truth over silence. The true inheritance was not gold, not land, not a tavern or a fortune. It was the strength to carry truth, the courage to face the storm, and the unshakable bond between a grandfather and his granddaughter that even death could not break. Aaliyah carried that inheritance with her as she left the town behind, the medallion warm in her pocket, the memory of the oak tree in her heart, and the certainty that she had kept his trust alive. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never skip a story like this again. Watch our other shocking videos waiting for you on the channel. You won't believe what's coming next. And share this video with your friends and family. Let them see the truth unfold too.